Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I am honored to be here and doing the final talk in this presentation on what is one of the epic battles of American military history. When we were talking about who was going to get to do what in terms of speaker assignments, I guess I drew sort of the short end of the straw in that I'm doing what you might refer to as the mopping up phase, which any soldier will tell you is one of the most hated words in the lexicon because you can be killed just as dead during mopping up as you can during the glorious parts of the battle. But nevertheless, that's my job today, is to put a capstone on the talks and to think about Iwo Jima from a larger perspective. Unfortunately, when you do that, you don't necessarily come up with many uplifting messages. And so after much struggle trying to figure out what my title slide should be, here it is: Iwo Jima, harbinger of more awfulness to come. And so with that, I'd like to get into it. I want to do three things today. I want to talk about the immediate aftermath on the island itself, and then I want to dive into both the Japanese situation and the American situation, both militarily and domestically. And I'm going to spend actually a fair amount of time on the American Homefront to try to paint a picture of what is going on there and what that portends for the longer term struggle as we're going on through 1945. So on Iwo Jima itself, congratulations, United States Marine Corps. 5 weeks of savage combat has left you in possession of 8 square miles of this. When Dad used to say, "Someday, son, all this will be yours," well, Merry Christmas. You have now come into the proud possession of 8 miles of volcanic island. And yes, there are some upsides to this. Obviously, we now have a very important air base that is just about 650 miles away from Tokyo. We can put our P-51 Mustangs on that. Yay, team. We also now have an emergency landing strip for our B-29s. I love this photograph and the sort of the smoking earth, which just gives you a sense for just how god-awful this place actually is. Meanwhile, on the island itself, by the time that the Marines actually sort of call it on March 26th, there are actually still around 3,000 Japanese troops still alive on this island. And in many cases, they are actively waging a sort of guerrilla war against the American installations, and particularly these airfields. And so it falls to the lot of the lucky 147th Regimental Combat Team of the U.S. Army to do their bit of the mopping up on the island itself. And they will be engaged here for the remainder of the war. And in the process of those operations, they're going to take another 867 Japanese as prisoners of war. Many of those are Korean construction workers, and will kill another 1,602 Imperial Army soldiers. An unknown number of other Japanese soldiers unquestionably died during these operations, either died of wounds, of starvation, of disease, or were bulldozed or entombed in caves and bunkers and left. So it's the case, too, that the final Japanese soldier on this island will not surrender until 1949. So despite the fact that the island is now, quote, secure, there's still a lot of low-level combat that's going to go on for the rest of the war here. So this sort of thing is still happening. A lot of flamethrower work against bunkers and caves. And then scenes like this. This is actually the field hospital, the 2nd Independent Mixed Brigade, that was discovered in April of 1945, and we actually managed to convince about 63 Japanese to come out and surrender. So now I'd like to kind of zoom over to the Japanese home islands, because what ends up happening in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Iwo Jima, there's a fall of another Japanese government, the government of Koichi Koiso. And the government that is going to take over after Koiso is headed up by this gentleman, Prime Minister Suzuki, along with his foreign minister Togo. And then the other important people in his cabinet are the Army and Navy ministers, respectively, and their 2 chiefs of staff. These six guys are known as the Big Six, and they are the head of the Council for the Supreme Direction of the War. And these are really the only individuals that have any real say-so in Japan at this time. Of course, there are two others that do as well, Emperor Hirohito and his Lord Privy Seal, Kido, who is really the sort of the gatekeeper to the emperor. So these eight guys are calling all the shots in Japan at this point. If you were to lay these gentlemen out on a spectrum of, hard line, never surrender, down to it's time to give up the ghost right now, the picture would look something like this. You've got a trio of military hardliners on the extreme never surrender end of the spectrum, and in particular, Army Minister Anami, who is arguably at this point the most important man in Japan. Because with the Navy's virtual destruction by this point in the war, the Army has far more political capital, not to mention more boots on the ground in Japan as well. And to Anami's way of thinking, it is preferable for every man, woman, and child in Japan to die rather than to surrender to the Americans. Suzuki, Hirohito, and Kido are not quite that militant, but they are still in a mood for fighting because they believe that what needs to happen is for Japan to win one last victory so that they can negotiate then from a position of strength. And so that's where they fall. And then you've got our Navy Minister Yonai, who's kind of on the fence. And finally, the only guy in the cabinet that really is interested in peace negotiations is the foreign minister, Togo. So I think you can see that in the short term, at least, the prospects for actually coming to a negotiated settlement in this war are very, very dim. Japan's military situation at this point is verging on catastrophic. They are now completely isolated from all of the territories down in the south that provide them oil, tin, rubber, etc., etc. The Imperial Navy, as I mentioned, has been effectively destroyed. The bulk of the Imperial Army is still in China and Southeast Asia, and because of the American submarines and mining campaign, they're actually almost cut off from Japan themselves. And so if the Japanese are going to manage to defend those home islands, they are going to have to raise brand new forces on the islands themselves and equip those forces in order to repel what is increasingly being seen as an inevitable American invasion. They still have several thousand aircraft, but they have very little fuel. And the result is that most of those aircraft now are reserved for kamikaze operations. So pictorially, this is kind of what's going on. All of the garrisons in the Central Pacific had either been conquered or bypassed and left. The Americans are now sitting in Okinawa, which just cuts all of the sea lanes to the south. And so Japan is still in control of enormous swaths of Asia, particularly in China and Southeast Asia. They probably have the better part of 500 million people under their control, but they are isolated increasingly from the raw materials that underwrite their war-making potential. If we look at the situation domestically, it too is horrendous and increasingly so. In the middle of the Iwo Jima campaign, firebombing kicked off on the night of March 9th and 10th. And by the time we get to around June of 1945, the Americans will have demolished most of Japan's major urban areas and are starting to move to secondary and tertiary targets. Japanese industry is in the process of going into its death spiral. They are cut off from their raw materials. We're destroying their plant and equipment progressively. And increasingly, there's a problem with worker absenteeism as Japan's workers are spending more and more time just scrounging around for food or trying to find shelter. Nevertheless, the Big Six opt to continue fighting. And the goal is to defeat the upcoming U.S. invasion. And if they can throw that invasion back into the ocean, or at least make it as bloody as possible, they hope to be able to force the Americans to the table for a compromise peace. As a result of that, every able-bodied man and woman in Japan at this point has been formally moved over to the role of military auxiliary and are attached to whatever Imperial Army unit happens to be in your neighborhood. And so the line between civilian and soldier at this point has been, if not blurred, completely erased. The result is that if the Americans come ashore in a place like Kyushu, they're going to be absolutely enormous civilian casualties as we're trying to figure out, is the person that I'm shooting at who's wearing a kimono, is that actually a civilian, or does she have a bamboo spear that she's hiding and she's going to try to go after me with? Which means that there are going to be enormous civilian casualties as a result of any of these military actions, and that is perfectly acceptable as far as the Big Six are concerned. The Japanese are not stupid, and they understand that the Americans will try to invade under the cover of land-based air power. And they recognize that given now the new American air bases that are going to be set up in Okinawa, that it's going to take 2 operations to get all the way up to Tokyo. And that means that it is likely enough that the Americans' first operation is going to be aimed at the island of Kyushu, the southernmost in the Japanese archipelago. If you take a look at Kyushu itself, you can see that, like most of Japanese territory, it's extremely hilly and mountainous. And as it turns out, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where the landing beaches in southern Kyushu are. They're down around Miyazaki and near Sendai as well. And so the result is that the Japanese Big Six decide to bet the ranch on what they're calling Operation Ketsugo, where they're going to load up Kyushu with as much combat power as possible right behind those beaches and hopefully kick the American invasion back into the ocean. The net result of all of this is, political obstinacy plus a collapsing economy plus the prospect of a pending invasion means that the Japanese leadership has now positioned Japan to be on the receiving end of a massive human catastrophe. There is going to be starvation if this war continues through the winter of 1945-1946. Could be as many as 10 million people. And not only that, but in combination with direct military action in Kyushu that could kill God knows how many, I think it's very conservative to say that had that invasion gone down and the war lasted into the spring of 1946, the Japanese could have been handed a bill of another 10 to 16 million dead in the course of this conflict. Meanwhile, on the American side of things, the military situation, as soon as we get done with Iwo Jima, within just about a week, is going to be the kickoff for the Battle of Okinawa, which is going to be another eye-opener for the Americans. It's going to run for about 80 days worth of combat. And in the course of this operation, we are going to suffer another 75,000 U.S. casualties, along with 12,500 killed. We're going to have to do in between 80 and 100,000 Japanese military men to take the island. And we kill somewhere between 40 to 100,000. Some estimates in Okinawa say that we may have killed 150,000 of the civilian population on that island, meaning we probably killed roughly between a third and a half of the civilian population, which, again, if you're an American military planner and you're fast forwarding to what's it going to be like if we go into southern Kyushu, that island as a whole has a population of 10 million people. There's probably 3.5 to 4 million or more in the combat area in the south. How many of those are we going to end up killing in the course of this operation? I think it's kind of interesting to sort of take a look at, the Battle of the Bulge gets all of the press when it comes to big battles that the Americans participated in the war. And it's true that it is the largest battle that the U.S. Army fights during that war. But if you kind of take a look at the numbers and grind them, and there's nothing I love better than a good number grind, what you can see is that, yes, the Bulge had way more U.S. troops involved. It didn't actually end up generating that many more casualties, though, about 89,500 in total. If you take a map of the Battle of the Bulge and then superimpose Okinawa over it, it looks something like this, except that the actual combat in Okinawa took place just in this orange zone here that you see down in the south. And then you can also see this little pink pork chop. That's Iwo Jima superimposed across this entire battle area as well. So you can see that Okinawa's casualties are compressed into much smaller area. So again, if we grind those numbers, Bulge versus Okinawa, at the Bulge we're losing about 10 KIA per square mile. Here on Okinawa we're losing about 121 per square mile, making it 13 times bloodier than the Bulge. And if you throw in Iwo Jima, you find that Iwo Jima was 78 times worse than Bulge on a per acre basis, I guess I would say. Another way to look at what's going on in terms of casualties is to look at the ratio that we are handing out to the Japanese. So if you look at the Marianas campaign in the middle of 1944, we're inflicting casualties on the Japanese at a rate of between 2 and 4 to 1. When we go down to Peleliu a little later in that year, all of a sudden that ratio drops to 1 to 1. Why? Because the Japanese have switched over to a defense in depth strategy. They're now intentionally, instead of trying to kick us off these beachheads, they're digging in depth and making us come to them and dig them out. The goal being to draw this thing out as long as possible and inflict maximum casualties. And Peleliu is really one of the first examples of that. Now, all of a sudden, our casualty ratio drops 1 to 1. And here we are in Iwo Jima, it drops to be 0.8 to 1. This is not a healthy trend, obviously. And yes, it's true that the majority of our casualties were wounded in action, and the vast majority of the Japanese were killed in action. But nevertheless, again, if you're having to face up to future operations, which are going to be much larger, and we end up suffering these same sort of casualty ratios, you can see that this is not a healthy trend at all. The same thing is basically occurring here on Okinawa. It's a little better, 1.3 to 1. Woohoo. In any case, Americans looking down the road are thinking to themselves, Kyushu is just going to be a real pain. Another way to look at things is just in terms of the casualties that are being inflicted on U.S. leadership. And these are numbers actually that Rich Frank dug up for me in the not too distant past. You can see that during a lot of the earlier campaigns, even places that were pretty hard, like Guadalcanal and Peleliu, were suffering casualties in our battalion commanders. And these are guys that are, usually well behind the line, of between 11 to 33%, something like that. But then all of a sudden, as we get into the later war stuff, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa are just in a class by themselves. Now, all of a sudden, if you're a battalion commander, odds are that 2/3 of you are going to be either wounded or killed in action. Our operations are indeed exactly what the Japanese are anticipating. We are going to do a first invasion of Kyushu called Operation Olympic, and then we're going to hop up to Tokyo in Operation Coronet, which is scheduled for early 1946. Our plan of campaign is that we think that the Japanese are only going to have at most about 350,000 personnel on Kyushu. We're going to bring around 750,000 to the party, and particularly at the point of contact on the invasion beaches themselves, we are assuming that we're going to come in with at least 3 to 1 superiority. The problem is that the Japanese, again, having decided to bet the ranch in March of 1945, throw spanners in those works. If we had been lucky enough to actually invade Kyushu in January of 1945, we would have been up against just a single division. But as the months progressed during 1945, and particularly from April on, you can see that more and more forces just get poured into Kyushu until finally by July of 1945, the picture looks something like this. And understand that there's a lag time here between when the Americans actually are able to identify these units through radio intelligence and photo reconnaissance and that sort of thing, and begin assigning unit designations to these troops. There's obviously, a month or two delay, but by July of 1945, there are just all sorts of red flags going up in Washington and Guam, where our naval headquarters is now, about what the tea leaves are reading here in terms of what Kyushu is shaping up to be. Because the bottom line is that by July of 1945, the Japanese don't have 350,000 men in here. They have 900,000 men. They have more than 10,000 aircraft that are within range of the invasion beaches, meaning that instead of coming in against these beaches at 3-1, in many cases we're going to be coming in at 3-2 or even parity in some cases, which is not a healthy recipe for success during an amphibious operation. The result of that is going to be that there was clearly a come to Jesus meeting that was going to happen sometime real soon, that was going to come down to basically institutional lines, Army versus Navy. And in this contest, it was the Army's opinion that the fundamental driver here is getting this war over with as rapidly as possible. Time is the enemy, whereas from the Navy's viewpoint, casualties are the enemy. I don't know how this meeting would have turned out. My cards are usually on Ernie King whenever it comes to these sort of bureaucratic infighting sort of contest, among other things, because the Navy has the ships to move those troops, and if the Navy says we're not going. But the real decider was probably going to have to be Harry Truman, the newly installed president. And, this was not going to be a happy decision that he was going to have to make. Meanwhile, on the American Homefront, I'd like to take you through sort of a tour of New York Times headlines, because I think at 80 years removed, it's easy for us to focus and over-focus on sort of the valiant imagery around the Battle of Iwo Jima. Obviously Rosenthal's photo being the most famous image arguably taken during the war. But I think we sort of had this rose-colored glasses version that, by the time we get to the middle of 1945, the home front is locked arm in arm along with our allies, and we are marching in lockstep towards victory over the Japanese. I would like to paint a slightly different picture of that. So the first thing I want to show you is the front page on March 17th, which is when the Marine Corps actually claimed that Iwo Jima is now secure, which I think is kind of optimistic given the fact that General Kuribayashi isn't going to be dead for another week or more. But nevertheless, what you can see as a result of this is Iwo Jima doesn't even make front page news, barely. That it is a much lower priority headline than what is going on in Europe. And in fact, the New York Times headlines are going to be focused almost exclusively on Europe here for the next month and a half or so, as the Reich is going into its death spiral. April 12th, of course, the death of President Roosevelt gets all the news, and rightly so. And then we get into the end of April with the Russians now moving into the Battle of Berlin and encircling Hitler's headquarters. On the 28th of April, of course, you get the dramatic meeting up of American and Soviet troops at the River Elbe. And then on May 2nd, Hitler is dead. 8th of May, VE Day. And this is the first time, actually, that you see Okinawa make one of the top headlines for like the last 3 or 4 weeks. And at this point, of course, the battle in Okinawa has been going on for more than a month, but they saw fit to at least put it into, the top headline here on the 8th of May. Immediately after that, the following day, Truman reaches out and says, we're only halfway through this war, right? Just to keep the American public in the mode of, this thing isn't over yet. And this is a recurring theme that we're going to see now for the remaining several months of the war. Here on May 11th, now the Army comes out with a demobilization plan and says, okay, we're going to be awarding points on the basis of, length of service, is the soldier in question a father, et cetera, et cetera. If you got 85 points, that's the magic number. You're going home. And so the Army then is announcing, you can see down here in this little sidebar, that 1.3 million men are going to go out this year and are going to be demobilized. The problem with this, of course, is that those high point guys are the guys that have the most experience in combat, meaning that it's going to be the less experienced dudes that are going to be left in the Army. A lot of these divisions are going to be losing their small unit commanders. So this is absolutely not what you want from a unit cohesion standpoint if you are going into an operation aimed at southern Japan where you can expect the combat to be absolutely awful. Nevertheless, that is what the American public expect at this point, that we're going to bring a lot of these boys home. Again, the following day, it explicitly tells us that the guys who fought through the North Africa and the European campaign, they are going to be gone. Meanwhile, Americans advance on Okinawa. Here we are on the 20th of May. Okinawa battle unabated. Key Hill won for fifth time. This is Sugarloaf we're talking about. And think about the contrast here between the fact that the Red Army rolled into Berlin in the middle of the middle of April 1945. They captured a city of 3 million people in a little over 2 weeks. Yeah, they paid about 500,000 casualties in the process of doing that. But nevertheless, I think you can see there's this incredible contrast here between the headlines and the sort of the nature of the fighting that we are encountering on Okinawa. Key Hill won for fifth time? Are you kidding me? A couple days later, on 5th June, we see Marines win half of Naha Airfield. Yay, team. 2 days after that, now we've got all of Naha Airfield. But again, just the emotional impact of the combat here and on Okinawa, it's just so much slower, so much more grinding. And the American public at home, I think, is aware of this. The size of the Army is going to be an ongoing issue for this year. And so here's Marshall saying, we've got to be cautious in terms of slimming down our troop profile. But then the following day, on 6th May, we're saying that we're going to send 6 million picked troops against the Japanese, which I find just deliciously ironic, because when we typically say picked troops, we mean these are the elite. But in this case, we know that these picked troops have been picked because they are the low point guys that have the least combat experience in the Army. And these are the poor saps that are going to get it to go up against the Japanese in Kyushu. Wonderful. 1st of June, the U.S. now announces we're going to double the size of our Army in the Pacific. And, that makes sense. At this point, the Army comprises about 1.8 million people in the Pacific, and we're going to beef that up now to more than 3.5 million, the majority of those, again, being these low point guys that are going to come over from Europe. And we start seeing that in the headlines as well. So here we are on the 18th of June. Here's the first one of these divisions, the 86th, to arrive home, and these guys are immediately going to be put on trains. ETO to Tokyo is what the banner says. And lo and behold, just a little bit later in July, now all of a sudden, American civilians can no longer get Pullman sleeper cars, because guess what? We need all of those cars to move this enormous quantity of troops. More than 1.5 million of them are going to have to be moved across the continent to the West Coast so they can be transshipped out to the Pacific. Meanwhile, though, you have contrasting images of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth bringing home the high points guys. So here's a headline that, this one day we saw 34,000 troops arrive home to be discharged. And you can imagine what the guys out in the Pacific think about all this. These guys on Queen Mary are going to be getting all the jobs while we're still out here in the Pacific slogging this thing to a close. There's a rebellion against the draft in the Senate on 4 April. The draft bill comes in and it is rejected, and eventually there's a lot of horse trading that happens, and a compromise is reached on the 25th of April where, we'll pass the bill, but we are now prohibiting 18-year-olds to be sent off to combat unless they have 6 months worth of training. The underlying hope being, of course, that this war is going to be over within 6 months, and that just won't be necessary. You see then military bigwigs like Eisenhower, Marshall, and King all weighing in and saying, we got to keep the draft going, and we're going to need it in peacetime too. So there's a real tension there between what the home front wants and what the military thinks it needs. We're kicking off the 7th war bond drive as well. And here we have Secretary Morgenthau, thanking the public for taking VE Day in stride and going ahead and doubling down on the $34 billion raise that we're trying to do here to keep this war in operation. There are looming consumer shortages as well. So here's an article from 21 June talking about ex-President Hoover offering proposals to ease the shortage of meat. And you see the same thing for butter. You see the same thing for sugar. You see the same thing around fruit. There are near riots in New York City when 2,000 fruit stores in New York announced that we can't make any money because of the price controls that the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, has put on us. We're going to close down, which leads to, on the following day, Mayor LaGuardia coming in and saying, well, if that happens, the city will set up fruit stands so that housewives can buy fruit. Again, not exactly a happy look. And this is front page news in the New York Times. And of course, the supply of cigarettes, too, is an ongoing concern. The Office of Price Administration, as you can imagine, is not super popular on the home front. And so we see here in the 23rd of June a rebellion against the OPA in the House of Representatives, where they push back against the power of the OPA to set prices. And on the following day, a new food czar is named. You have another article here about 13 governors are urging a major overhaul of the food rationing system. So again, the American population is just sick of the various strictures that are being put on it as a result of the war, particularly when we've now just won in Europe, which was the biggest of the two conflicts. Then there's the matter of how are we going to reconvert industry from military to civilian usage. Back in the 1st of April, the very first day of the Okinawa campaign, Secretary Burns is saying, we're going to have a speedy return to a free economy. Fast forward 3 months, and now all of a sudden we're saying, reconversion is actually going to be tied to the length of the war. So that is the last thing, again, that the civilian population wants to be hearing. Okay, so we get to 27th of July. We issue what's known as the Potsdam Declaration, where basically President Truman says, you need to surrender right now or we are going to destroy you straight up. And the reaction, of course, from the Japanese government over the next couple of days is that the empire is going to fight to the last bloody dribble. And the Suzuki government then officially turns down the Potsdam Declaration and says that they will take no further notice of this proclamation. Again, exactly the last thing that the American Homefront wants to be hearing. So I think, if we look at this sort of overall image of, marching in lockstep towards victory, I would say, brother, it just ain't so. That the American Homefront is extremely fractious. And really, this propaganda poster really paints the mood much more better. That you have guys out in the Pacific who are like, what are we, chopped liver? Because we know that the war isn't over, but a lot of people back on the home front really wish it was. Bottom line, the American military, I would argue, is increasingly dominant in the Pacific, but we are also faced with the prospect of enormous ongoing casualties, and combat in Kyushu is a tremendous unknown. We just don't know what it is going to be like, but all the tea leaves are saying it's going to be bad, just some flavor of bad. And at the same time that we're facing up to that, we are also confronting critical manpower shortages and particularly shortages of our most experienced troops, in that the guys that are going to be coming over from Europe are not going to be the best guys to have in uniform for what promises to be an extremely bloody and difficult invasion. Meanwhile, the American Homefront is very restive. I wouldn't say that morale is collapsing, but it is clear that the American people are increasingly frustrated with both the wartime restrictions that have been placed on them and also Japanese intransigence about ending a war that most people on the home front view that we have clearly won at this point. Why won't you give up? And all in all, I think you can understand then why the overall emotion on the part of the Americans, at least, is just one of incredible relief when the war ends up ending in this situation. And honestly, I would have to say that from the Japanese perspective, having been spared the prospect of a military and starvation calamity that probably would have carried off another 10, 15, 16 million people easily, they too, a lot of them were breathing a sigh of relief as well when the war ended as abruptly and honestly as strangely as it did at the end of August 1945. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I really wish I could be with you. Thank you so much for coming to this conference on what is honestly a truly momentous and fascinating battle. I hope you have a wonderful time at the remainder of the conference.